Good evening then from Nottingham, a city in shock tonight after a series of violent attacks left 3 people dead and others injured. Police here say they are keeping an open mind over the motive for the killing spree. It all began just before 4 a.m. this morning when officers were called here to Ilkeston Road when 2 19-year-olds were found dead in the street. Then news of another crime on Milton Street, a mile away. 3 people were injured after a driver tried to run them over. A short time afterwards, a 50-year-old man was found dead in Magdala Road. That's about 1.5 miles away. Then police stopped a van on Maple Street where they tasered and then arrested a 31-year-old man on suspicion of murder. Well, we now know that 2 of the victims attended Nottingham University. We'll bring you more on how the violence has affected the large student population here and the city at large. But first, Sky's national correspondent Tom Parminter has tonight's first report.
Still scattered on the floor, the suspect's cap, bag and jacket. He'd just been pulled out of this van at gunpoint. There were bullet holes in the windscreen of the vehicle, but the suspect was dragged out alive.
I heard the police straight away, and as soon as I heard it, I came to the window and then I saw everything. Like, I saw them draw their guns or whatever they had at him. I saw them drag him out.
He seemed to be complying with them.
No, they dragged him out. He wasn't really complying.
Stopping him was the priority after 3 people had been killed and 3 others were in hospital. That moment brought this violent spree across this city to an end. The 31-year-old was taken into custody, arrested on suspicion of murder. 19-year-old Barnaby Webber from Somerset was one of those stabbed to death on Ilkeston Road at 4 a.m, where a night out partying had been drawing to an end. He was a keen cricketer. His club, Bishop's Hole near Taunton, said he was a key part of their success, playing over 30 games and scoring 622 runs. Friends in Nottingham placed a cricket shirt and cap among the flowers in St Peter's Church. There were tributes too to another 19-year-old called Grace, who'd been on a night out with Mr Webber. After the stabbings, the suspect drove the white van into the city centre, past the Theatre Royal, where he hit 3 pedestrians. 1 is critically injured in hospital. The 3rd victim, a man in his 50s, was found dead here on Magdala Road. As forensic searches got underway, armed police were back on Ilkeston Road, smashing their way into this terraced house as their investigation moved at pace.
We are still in the early stages of the investigation. I need to determine exactly what the motives were behind this attack. We are keeping an open mind and are working closely with counter-terrorism policing to establish the facts.
It could take days to establish the motive. The forensic searches finding every witness or piece of CCTV. Several properties remain cordoned off, and for now, it is a murder inquiry led by Nottinghamshire Police. This city stands together and waits for an explanation. Tom Parminter, Sky News, Nottingham.
Well, this part of the city is well used to a vibrant nightlife. Students at Nottingham University should tonight have been attending their graduation ball. Instead, many of them attended a vigil in memory of those killed. Becky Johnson has this report.
In the darkest of times, they came to light candles. The shock on young faces, friends left in disbelief that 2 of their fellow students are among the dead. Between the flowers, a cricket cap, left at a vigil to remember the lives so suddenly cut short.
Literally hundreds of people poured in and out of this church here in the centre of a city that's been filled with grief and shock today, and you could sense that palpably here. Many young people, many students who came here to just to be in it, do something today when they've kind of felt an overwhelming sense of loss.
Students are living just yards from where their friends were stabbed. The road where they were attacked is a well-trodden route back after nights out in the city centre. The fear among students is it could have been anyone.
I was going to go home on Saturday, but I just booked my train ticket. I'm going to go tomorrow. Like, I know it's not like a normal thing that happens here, but it's still a bit stressful, so I'm just going to go home.
This young, vibrant part of the city has felt eerily quiet as police cordons block off streets that should have been full of students out enjoying the sun at the end of term. With large parts of the city affected, the atmosphere here has been tense. The main question is why anyone would do this. Across Nottingham, police continue their work to find answers for the victims and their loved ones.
Thoughts and prayers are just with their families. As a parent, you just can't imagine that phone call from the police to them to tell them that they're, as we now know, young people, students, just 19 years old, are not coming home again.
It is that horror that's haunting this city, but people here are determined to join together to try to find strength in each other. Becky Johnson, Sky News, Nottingham.
Good evening from Miami, where Donald Trump today became the most high-profile person to ever face charges under America's Espionage Act. He appeared in the court behind me, accused of risking national security by removing highly classified documents about the United States weapons programs and the country's defense vulnerabilities and storing them in the ballroom of his Mar-a-Lago resort. After he pled not guilty and departed court, he made an impromptu stop at a local Cuban cafe en route to yet another fundraising event. Our US correspondent Mark Stone has our first report.
The first glimpse of a president on the day he went to court.
Mr. Trump, why were you holding nuclear secrets, sir? Hey.
No answer to the question which has brought Donald Trump to this moment in US history. With his son Eric at his golf club outside Miami, and with his legal team, America's 45th president was about to be the first to be charged under the Espionage Act.
President Trump, how are you feeling?
Great, he says, and then into the armoured vehicle for the convoy to court. A slow drive-by outside the resort, and as every second of this was captured, he was on his own social media site. Witch hunt, he posted. At court, the crowds had swelled for a spectacle that we wouldn't see. Away from the cameras on the 13th floor in courtroom number 3, President Trump, along with his aide, Walt Nauta, surrendered themselves to the duty magistrate. They were under arrest on federal charges. Outside, one of the president's lawyers was commanding the airways, owning the moment, and with more than a hint of the way Mr. Trump wants this to play out.
The decision to pursue charges against President Trump while turning a blind eye to others is emblematic of the corruption that we have here. We are at a turning point in our nation's history.
The truth is that the cases she mentions against Joe Biden and others are under investigation.
We love Trump!
But if the aim is to pit the people against the institutions that are supposed to hold the country together, well, then his national support base is certainly strong enough to deepen the division.
He was in the courthouse for almost exactly an hour. He sat stone-faced, and it was left for his lawyer to say, "We most certainly plead not guilty."
Then, as the convoy left, this. He is an anti-Trump protester, and he was quickly arrested.
Well, one man detained here, but this is just the sort of tension that the authorities will be worried about.
And then this day of spectacles moved on to the city's most famous Cuban cafe and a photo opportunity. Impromptu on the face of it, but planned, of course. and it was President Trump who had the last word.
I think it's a rigged deal here. We have a rigged country. We have a country that's corrupt. We have a country that's got no borders. We have a country that's got nothing but problems.
He'll head now to New Jersey, his golf course there, and a news conference later. Mark Stone, Sky News in Miami.
So that then the start of one of the most consequential prosecutions this country has ever seen. That Donald Trump could still become president even after he's charged with espionage is a quirk of America's legal system. He's become a symbol of this divided country. His supporters back him without question. His detractors are resigned to his political impunity. Our international correspondent John Sparks has been hearing both sides of the argument.
There are places in Miami where people go to let their hair down. Acts of escape when confrontation comes to town. But the prosecution of Donald Trump won't change their world.
You can just look at the past couple of years. Nothing changed people's, so why would this be any different?
I'm happy that he is actually being indicted for crimes he probably committed.
Okay.
I mean, there's evidence he committed them, so I just didn't think it was ever going to happen.
The prosecution of the former president has shocked many in Florida. The state votes Republican, and it votes for Donald Trump. And there are those who think the government is out to get him. But on Ocean Drive, people see things in a different way. At the world-famous Palace drag show, people say the former president doesn't speak to and hasn't spoken up for them.
What do you make of Donald Trump?
To be honest with you, I don't see him.
You don't see him?
I don't. I don't. Unfortunately, like we have someone that is against our community, and as you could see, we are not hurting anybody. And we are about love, and we are about acceptance, and we just want to be here and live life the way that everybody wants to live their lives fully.
90 minutes up the road, we found different performers on a very different stage. This event hosted by Club 47, part of Donald Trump's so-called base. And the featured speaker, aspiring office holder, Carrie Lake.
Trump is a warrior, a warrior. He's Godzilla, and they're just little tiny geckos running around.
Trump's indictment, the product of Joe Biden's fearful regime, she said, and we didn't see anyone objecting.
I love you, Donald J. Trump.
I wonder what people will think when they see boxes of government records in his storage room, his shower room, his bedroom, other rooms. It doesn't play well, does it?
Well, I think it doesn't play well for Joe Biden either, who has him in his garage.
If the former president's made mistakes, the Democrats have done worse. And the Republicans of Florida, well, they have a nation to save. John Sparks, Sky News, Miami Beach.
Well, our US correspondent Mark Stone is here with me. Quite a day, Mark, and now a trial awaits a former president who faces charges that he risked national security but could still end up in the White House.
Yeah, it's a truly remarkable moment, and right or wrong, and the country is so split, we do now face the prospect of the trial. Of course, there will be legal arguments. His defense will try and find ways to throw this out of court. They will also do everything that they can to delay. That is a classic tactic of Donald Trump. We've seen it in his other court cases, and there are many. He tries to delay, and he will try and do that to take this into the election campaign, beyond the election campaign, possibly. But this is, without question, I think, the most consequential and the most watched prosecution in US history. Forget Watergate, that never went to trial. That was an impeachment, it wasn't a trial. This is absolutely huge. In the immediate term, right now he's in the air. He's on his way up to his Bedminster golf course where he was that day last week, seems like ages ago, when the indictment dropped, when it was unsealed, when we all saw what he is alleged to have done. He was playing golf then. I imagine he'll be playing golf there tomorrow. But first of all, later tonight, he will be on the airwaves, owning the moment once again, talking to his supporters, talking to the country, he hopes, to present his narrative of what he thinks happened. It will be, like it was here, divisive stuff, I would think.
Mark Stone, thank you. And then celebrating his 77th birthday tomorrow as well. Yes, full coverage of the final part of Trump's day, if you like, when he will be making those remarks up in Bedminster. 8:15 local time, 1:15 in the morning UK time. We'll have full coverage of that. For now, let's head back to Sally for more of the day's news in London.
Anna, thank you. Good evening. Death, misery and incalculable loss, the impact of coronavirus as described by the lead counsel to the public inquiry, which began hearing evidence today. Outside, a dignified vigil of bereaved family members held a silent protest, demanding to know whether their loved ones' deaths could have been averted if the UK had been better prepared for a pandemic. Our home editor, Jason Farrell, has been hearing from some of them.
Komang Miriana Eels, Mira.
What sets this inquiry apart
Louise Healy.
is that it examines events that have hugely impacted each and every one of us.
William Roy Edwards.
But some families more than others. Kim Nutt lost her husband to COVID. Ambulance driver Paul.
Paul Nutt.
The girls, my other daughter as well, begged him not to go to work because they were worried about his safety. And he said, the guidance says what I have to do and I'll adhere to it and I'll be safe. And it really wasn't.
The guidance was wrong.
The guidance was totally wrong.
At that time, Paul was told he didn't need to wear a mask. It was the testimonies of families that opened the inquiry, with a video played to the room.
I said, can you try and call us then if, you can, if there's time to get us up there. We don't want her to die alone. She was only 54. And she died alone 5 days after my dad.
The scope of this inquiry is immense, from the political decisions that were made when the virus arrived to the long-term impact on the health service. But this first round of evidence looks at whether we could and should have been better prepared.
Even at this stage, before hearing the evidence, it is apparent that we might not have been very well prepared at all.
The counsel to the inquiry told the chair, Lady Hallett, that previous administrations may have fallen short.
Following the Ebola outbreak, it was right that the G7 devoted significant time to how best to try and prevent a future global pandemic.
That despite this pledge from David Cameron, there was a failure to consider the need for mass testing or how to protect the vulnerable. There was a blinkered focus on the likelihood of a flu pandemic. And anyway, resilience plans were consumed by preparations for Brexit.
The families expect the evidence will show a lack of responsibility in government for civil emergency preparedness, with little or no ministerial leadership, and a chaos of committees which led to poor planning and ultimately a reactive rather than proactive response to the virus.
And the Association of Directors of Public Health confirmed it was chaotic.
At the start of the pandemic, directors were learning about new policies and guidance at the same time as members of the public were, when the televised 5 p.m. daily briefings began to be broadcast.
These are the details families want to know. What do you want to come out of this inquiry?
The truth and what actually happened.
We need to know about the decisions that were made, why they were made or why they weren't made, so that we can hopefully learn the lessons to prevent anything like this happening again.
The inquiry is expected to last more than 3 years. Jason Farrell, Sky News.
Before his death, 9-year-old Alfie Steele was beaten, dunked in cold water while naked and locked outside in the middle of the night. His neighbours repeatedly called the emergency services to report his screams. He had more than 50 injuries when he died. Today, his mother and her partner were convicted over his death after months of abuse. Dan Whitehead has been following the case, and a warning: his report contains details of Alfie's abuse.
I went in there and I got him out straight away. And
she was trying to explain away his injuries.
I think he bashed his head into the back because he's got some...
Her lies had begun when she called 999.
Ambulance service, is the patient breathing?
No, he's not. He fell asleep in the bath.
The truth is, 9-year-old Alfie Steele had been repeatedly beaten and then held under a cold bath as part of an ongoing regime of punishment. He had more than 50 injuries and showed signs he'd been deprived of oxygen. As his mother pretended she didn't know where her fiancé was,
Hello, where are you?
Dirk Howell was running away from the house. The police caught him as he tried to get on a train.
Put your hands up for me. So at the moment, you're under arrest.
Alfie had suffered over a year of abuse. There were times he was locked outside the house in Droitwich in Worcestershire. A neighbour recorded his desperate screams to be let in. Neighbours were so concerned they repeatedly called 999. This was April 2020.
I'm hearing some really worrying noises from next door. I've heard what sounds like a child in distress.
And this, a month later.
They had him in the garden, disciplining him. He's standing like a statue.
Your husband's had to report them before?
Yes, yes. This lad, we believe, is called Alfie.
Then, most significantly, this in August.
Police emergency.
Hello, it sounds like my neighbours are doing something bad to their kid in the bath, like they're really hurting them.
That was 6 months before Alfie's death. Police had put in place a protection plan that meant Dirk Howell wasn't allowed to stay overnight, a rule the couple repeatedly flouted. Alfie's removal from Carla Scott was discussed in the year before his death, in yet another case where a child known to authorities has died. An independent child safeguarding review is underway, but any lessons will come too late for Alfie. Dan Whitehead, Sky News.
Two South Wales police officers are being investigated for gross misconduct in relation to the deaths of 2 teenage boys, which sparked the Ely riots in Cardiff last month. The Independent Office for Police Conduct said a notice had been served to the driver and passenger in a police van seen driving behind the boys in the Ely area of the city. The deaths of 16-year-old Carice Sullivan and 15-year-old Harvey Evans led to riots in the local area. Boris Johnson has asked the Commons Privileges Committee to publish its report into whether he lied to Parliament without further delay. Mr Johnson said he wanted to let the world judge their nonsense, with the report not expected to be released until later this week. The trial of Connor Chapman, the man accused of killing Ellie Edwards outside a pub in Wallasey on Christmas Eve, has begun at Liverpool Crown Court. The jury was shown graphic CCTV footage of a man firing 12 shots, injuring 5 people and fatally wounding the 26-year-old who was enjoying a night out with friends. Now, you would have thought that paychecks growing at their fastest rate for 20 years would be good news. Well, it is for employees, but not for the economy. Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey today reiterated his concerns over how rising wages stoke what's described as core inflation. That's the rate at which prices rise once energy and food costs are stripped out. Here's our business correspondent, Paul Kelso.
The prize ingredient in a restaurant kitchen these days? The people. Britain has a shortage of workers and it's hit hospitality hard. The Oakman Group employs 1,600 people in 40 venues, but recruiting and retaining them comes at a price.
Since Brexit, it's got a lot harder again. There have been shortages across my industry. Our energy bill has gone up by about 70%. our labour costs by 20-odd%, food and drink by, food in particular, probably 20 plus, drink a bit lower. But we've only been able to achieve about an 8% increase in our prices. So profits are being squeezed, and we need a way out of it.
With more than 1 million vacancies unfilled across the country, competition for staff is forcing up pay. In the 3 months to April, wages were 7.2% higher than a year ago, the fastest increase outside the pandemic. But that's still less than CPI inflation running at 8.7%, which means real wages, the spending power of the pound in your pocket, actually fell 2.3%. There are fewer people working since COVID too, some through early retirement, but record numbers through long-term sickness, further squeezing the market. Rising wages is good news for workers. These figures include an increase in the minimum wage, but they can indicate trouble for the economy because they suggest that inflation is becoming ingrained, and that makes it more likely the Bank of England will again increase interest rates next week, and that will raise the cost of borrowing for everyone. Financial markets now think an increase is inevitable.
This morning's numbers illustrated we've got a very tight labour market in this country. We've had a fall in the supply of labour, which is showing signs of recovering, but very slowly, frankly. We still think the rate of inflation is going to come down, but it's taking a lot longer than we expected.
The tight labour market may be fueling inflation and restricting growth, and the price of some government borrowing has exceeded even the chaos of Liz Truss's mini-budget. Not a recipe for short-term success. Paul Kelso, Sky News in Woburn.
And welcome back to Nottingham at the end of one of this city's darkest days. In the early hours of this morning, an armed attacker stabbed 2 students here, then stole a van, killed its owner and attempted to mow down members of the public. Our crime correspondent Martin Brunt is with me here. First of all, let's talk about what we do know, and that is that several families are grieving tonight.
Yes, we've had throughout the day 3 statements from the police. Each has added a bit more information, particularly about the victims. Not too much detail, but we do know that one of them is Barnaby Webber, one of them's the 19-year-old student who was stabbed to death walking back the 1.5 miles from the city centre to his accommodation near here. We don't know yet the identity of the young woman who was with him, but bits of the pictures are beginning to be put together.
And what we don't know, frustratingly, is any idea of a motive.
No, initially, of course, everybody thought this is a potential terror attack. I think as the day's gone on, that's receded. It appears tonight to be a very much the focus on criminality of some description, but if it wasn't a terror attack, and there were CT, counter-terror officers here today, their role seems to have been diminished tonight. If it wasn't a terror attack, what on earth was it that possessed a man to go on the rampage, 3 separate attacks, leaving 3 people dead and 3 people injured, one of them tonight critically ill in hospital?
Okay, Martin, thanks very much indeed. And yes, it has been a truly awful day here, and everyone you meet in the street, everyone you talk to does have that one question that Martin posed then, and that question is why? Sally, back to you in London.
Mark, thank you. Well, that was Sky News at 10. Coming up, we'll take a first look at tomorrow's papers in the press preview, including this story on the front of The Guardian about those fatal attacks in Nottingham. Their headline, students among victims stabbed to death in Nottingham rampage. That story leading a lot of tomorrow's front pages. And tonight, we're joined by Sonia Soda, the chief leader writer at The Observer, and Henry Hill, the deputy editor of Conservative Home. We'll be speaking to them very shortly. See you after this short break. This is Sky News. In just a moment, the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. But first, our top stories. 2 19-year-old students and a man in his 50s were stabbed to death in Nottingham, while 3 other people were injured when the alleged attacker tried to run them over in a van stolen from one of the victims. Donald Trump has pleaded not guilty to 37 felony counts relating to the mishandling of confidential documents and obstruction of justice at a court hearing in Miami. And the COVID-19 inquiry has held its first public hearings with Chairwoman Baroness Hallett promising to put the suffering of victims at the heart of the inquiry. Hello there, you're watching the press preview. A first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. And it's time to see what's making the headlines with Sonia Soda, the chief leader writer at The Observer, and Henry Hill, the deputy editor of Conservative Home. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. We'll speak to them very shortly. But first, let's have a look at what's on some of those front pages. The Guardian leads with the attack in Nottingham, in which 3 people were killed. The Metro also leading on the attack, calling it a white van knife horror. The attacks in Nottingham also on the front of the Daily Mail. The Star's headline, Killers Rampage. And The Sun also calls the attack a rampage. The FT leads with the Governor of the Bank of England's words that inflation is taking a lot longer than hoped to come down. While the Eye says mortgage level stress is to hit levels last seen in the 1980s. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you're watching us. And we're joined tonight by Sonia Soda and Henry Hill. So let's get started, shall we? Very good evening to you both. Thanks so much for joining us. A very sombre press preview looking ahead to tomorrow's front pages, the majority of them leading on the horrific scenes in Nottingham today. Sonia, your take on all of this to start with.
Yes, so absolutely terrible scenes unfolded in Nottingham today. There's still a lot that's unclear about what happened overnight. But what we do know is that 2 students, both aged 19, were stabbed to death by a 31-year-old suspect involved, and a man in his 50s was also killed, and police suspect that he was the owner of the white van that the suspected killer used to drive around after as well as the deaths of the 2 19-year-olds. The van was driven, again, the police think it was the same suspect, into some people. They are okay, I think it was 2 people. So there's still a lot that we simply don't know yet. We know that this was a 31-year-old suspect. There's absolutely no information yet about what his potential motivations might be. We know that the counter-terrorism police have been involved, but the police say that that is normal with an incident of this scale where they're making so many inquiries. It's obviously absolutely devastating for the families of the 2 students who've lost their lives and their friends in Nottingham, and for the whole student community in Nottingham. But I think there's a lot that we still don't know here yet.
Yeah, absolutely. And Henry, you know, there's no words to describe really how terrible this is. 2 teenagers on their way home from a night out and then, you know, stabbed to death. But of course, the big question hanging over people in Nottingham is why?
Yes, it is. And we simply don't know. You know, this is an ongoing and active police investigation. The suspect was only taken into custody today. And there is a natural tendency to fill that kind of void with speculation. But I think it's important that, you know, we will find out, the police will release the information in due time, and we will have those answers. For the moment, I think it's important, one, you know, that we make sure that, you know, as the police will surely be doing, that there are no further attacks and that everybody is safe. And then it is important that we take the time to wait for the facts to emerge, that we don't rush to any conclusions or judgments. And that can be difficult when we have that void of information, because we naturally want to talk about something of this magnitude and we need to fill that space with something. But nothing good ever comes of doing that. So we will find out in due time. But for the moment, we simply don't know why this happened.
Yeah, absolutely. Police say they are keeping an open mind when it comes to the motive. And Sonia, I mean, there's not a huge amount of variety in terms of what's on the front pages tomorrow, but we're just going to mention the front page of The Sun now, which has the photographs of the two teenagers who they say were killed in Nottingham.
That's right. And as you said, it was, two 19-year-olds on the way home from a night out at 4 a.m. So it's a total tragedy. And as you would expect, this is a major national incident. It's been dominating news coverage all day. So you really would expect it to be on the vast majority of front pages, which it is.
Yeah, absolutely. Every parent's worst nightmare. Let's move on to the Financial Times. Henry, of course, one of the other big stories today is the COVID inquiry, which kicked off.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is Dame Heather Hallett's inquiry, which, may be familiar to viewers from the row between it and the Cabinet Office about the release of Boris Johnson's texts, which, due to the pace of events, already feels like it took place months ago. But in fact, my diary reminds me was in fact relatively recent. And this is the comprehensive investigation into what went wrong with or indeed right, in fairness, with the government's COVID response. It wants to investigate what lessons we can learn, whether the United Kingdom was prepared, and what good or bad steps were taken during that process. Now, it's mooted to take 3 years to complete. I don't think we're certain that it will take that long. Some of these judge-led inquiries have taken an awful lot longer to get to the truth. So I think there is a tension, and this is one of the problems with the way that we run public inquiries in this country, is that there is a tension between two of the objectives of the inquiry. The first is we want to find out what happened with the COVID response as quickly as possible so we can learn lessons. And the other is that we want to get really down into the guts of it so that we can find out who made bad decisions, assign blame, give some catharsis and closure to those who were affected by the pandemic and lost loved ones. Now, the first of those objectives would be better served by a much faster inquiry, a sort of an inquisitorial inquiry that maybe took evidence on a no-blame basis, on a black box basis that wasn't published, and that could get to the lessons really quickly so we could apply them. And then this other process could be conducted separately, and it could take more time to go into those granular details. But at present, we're lumping both of those together into one. And so we are going to take longer to get to some of those answers about pandemic preparedness than I think it would probably be ideal.
Yeah, and Sonia, it was really interesting, wasn't it? The lead counsel of the inquiry had some very interesting comments to make on this today in the inquiry opening, in terms of the lack of preparedness for a COVID pandemic and the fact that the country was distracted by dealing with Brexit.
Yeah, so this is the barrister who advises the inquiry, and I think we're going to be hearing a mix of things that sound quite familiar to us as the inquiry goes on, and stuff that is new. But this is the first day, and the first stage of the inquiry will be looking at preparedness. And there's already been a lot of discussion about preparedness. There's been revelations about exercises that took place in Whitehall, for example, in preparation for a flu pandemic, where recommendations and findings were not acted upon. But I think there's going to be more that emerges through the course of the inquiry. And it's obviously been, in the news in recent days and weeks, because there is this legal battle between the government and between the inquiry itself in terms of what material the government has to hand over, and whether it's the government who gets to decide what's relevant, or whether it's the judge in charge who gets to decide what's in the public interest and what should be released to the public. So that those legal wrangles may yet delay things more. I agree with. I think it's very important that there is this statutory inquiry that's led by a judge, where she does have the power to summon witnesses, where she does have the power to demand documents. I think that's incredibly important. But I also think that actually we could have probably done the sort of more rapid review that Harry's talked about. To be honest, I think we could have done that by now, and indeed a country like Sweden has already published their report. I've looked at some of the findings from that, for example, and so I think, you know, optimally we would have got the sort of rapid review with lessons for what we need to do differently if, you know, if hope this won't happen, of course, but if another pandemic were to sort of drop on our door in the next couple of years, you know, to have those lessons ready and waiting. But I do think that the statutory nature of this inquiry is really, really important, and you do need that thoroughness as well.
And Henry, of course, at the centre of this inquiry are the bereaved families, but there is also a sideshow in terms of Boris Johnson and his dispute with the Cabinet Office over, you know, releasing material to the inquiry.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is an ongoing dispute. Basically, the Dame Heather Hallett, the judge leading the inquiry, has requested that all of Boris Johnson's WhatsApp messages with 40 key members of the government be handed over to the inquiry so that they can be reviewed and anything relevant can be included in the inquiry's remit. Now, the dispute from the Cabinet Office is the Cabinet Office is wanting to hand over redacted versions because they say, while they're happy to hand over anything relevant, the WhatsApp exchanges contain all sorts of information which might not just be irrelevant, but might also be personal, and therefore it would be improper to hand that over. Now, I believe the Cabinet Office is going to take that to court. It will be very interesting to see whether or not they win. I think that, you know, Sir James Eadie, a very senior lawyer who works for the government, argues that it's essential for protecting the principle of free cabinet debate and private cabinet debate. He's a better lawyer than me, but I don't know whether that's going to hold water. But it really highlights, I think, the tension between the fact that all of the law covering this stuff is old, right? The Inquiries Act dates back to 2005. The Public Records Acts are much older than that. The Freedom of Information Act dates back to, I think, 2001. And all of that predates WhatsApp, and it predates the age when politicians, advisors, and officials would have had something like WhatsApp, where they were simultaneously conducting official business, personal business, private business, and all the rest of it. So I suspect that the Cabinet Office will end up having to hand over everything. It's not as if Dame Heather's threatening to publish it all. She and her team simply wish to go through it. I think that's going to be a very hard argument to resist. But it does highlight the fact that we need to bring the law governing public records and public information up to date so that we don't have this kind of dispute in future, and it's clear what the status of WhatsApp messages and so on are when a judge comes knocking at the door.
Yeah, certainly. It seems very unclear as things stand. Henry, Sonia will give you a little break, more to discuss. Coming up, more of our paper review, including coverage of former President Donald Trump's court case in Miami, as seen here in The Guardian. We'll be talking about that next.
If there's a journey that could be done in 2.5 hours or less by train, but also has an air route available, then the idea is that you can't do that by train anymore. Well, actually, we're saying in the UK it's all about choosing the right mode for the right journey. And in some cases, people will choose the train, typically if you can do city centre to city centre in less than 3 hours. But actually, many of our journeys in the UK take longer than that. Actually, 60% of our air routes are over water, which many people wouldn't realise, you know, Scottish Islands, Channel Islands, Northern Ireland and so on. So really what we're focused on is what's the solution to take the carbon out of flying so that we can still continue to enjoy the benefits of domestic air travel in future, and that's through a mix of efficiencies, but particularly sustainable aviation fuels and hydrogen in future.
Well, I mean, if it was here, it would be nothing short of a disaster with our current rail services, frankly. And I think consumer confidence is a really big issue for this internationally. So, you know, as Matt says, we actually don't have rail services as an alternative to a lot of our flights. But actually, even if there were, and I was travelling for business, or I had a connection to get, or I had an event to be at, would I trust a train service? Absolutely not. What France has done is a start, and it's got people thinking about it. But for it to do it successfully, it would have to be, as Matt says, a more international approach. And I think for UK consumers, there's a big confidence issue.
The UK sector was the first in the world to commit to net zero. We did that just before the pandemic, and actually the whole of the global industry and all of the world's governments have now made that same commitment. There are 2050, which is the goal we're all aiming at. Three big things that are going to get us there in aviation: more efficient aircraft and operations, modernising airspace is part of that, lighter planes, more efficient engines. That helps, but it doesn't get you to net zero. The two big unlocks for us, the biggest one is sustainable aviation fuels. These are drop-in fuels, so you can use them in today's planes, and they cut carbon by 70% or more from current operations. But there's also an exciting opportunity for hydrogen planes, completely zero-emission planes for shorter journeys in future. And the really exciting thing, actually, as we're talking about domestic travel in the UK, is that those hydrogen aircraft are going to be most suited to shorter routes, smaller aircraft sizes and shorter routes. So we expect them to first come on some of the domestic routes that we're talking about.
Welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me now, Sonia Soda, the chief leader writer at The Observer, and Henry Hill, the deputy editor of Conservative Home. And Sonia, to you first. Front page of your paper, like many, also covering Donald Trump's historic court appearance, extraordinary. Obviously, he's pleaded not guilty to all of these charges. But even if convicted, it won't necessarily stop him from returning to the White House.
No, and that's just kind of quite a crazy thing to say, isn't it? So it's a huge story. Donald Trump is facing 37 charges of concealing classified documents from federal officials. He appeared in a Miami courtroom today. And, you know, if he's found guilty of these charges, he could even end up in prison for decades. But that doesn't officially count him out of running for the presidency. Now, you might expect that a president, charged with these crimes, very, very serious crimes, facing trial, facing a grand jury, that in the court of public opinion might prevent him from running for the presidency again. But the issue is, of course, that America is hugely divided. His very loyalist voters don't believe that he's guilty of these charges. Obviously, that's yet to be determined. And he is portraying this as a witch hunt to his supporters. Now, that's a familiar refrain to us here in the UK, because Boris Johnson has also been using that term in relation to the Privileges Committee report and whether he misled Parliament, which we'll be talking about later. But yes, it's he says it's a witch hunt, that these charges are jumped up, and there are lots of people in America who believe that. So incredible though it may sound, he may still yet end up running for the presidency again, even with these charges hanging over him.
And Henry, Boris Johnson still dominating many headlines as well. He's urging tonight the Privileges Committee to publish their report, and many of them are predicting quite how damning it could be for him.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's good of him to urge them to publish it, but they were going to publish it anyway. And as far as I'm aware, they're going to publish it tomorrow anyway. But yes, absolutely. We haven't seen the Privileges report yet, but we can infer a lot from it, from the way Boris Johnson has responded to it. He was given advance sight of it on Friday, and he chose to resign from Parliament, which tells you, I think, an awful lot about what it's going to say. Now, the way this works is that effectively the Privileges Committee, which is a cross-party committee of MPs, which actually has a Conservative majority, although it's chaired by a Labour MP, have been investigating the allegation of whether or not Boris Johnson misled the House of Commons. They will recommend a sanction to the House of Commons, and the whole House of Commons, which again, remember, has a big Conservative majority, has to vote on it. And if they vote to suspend him for more than 10 days, then he is subject to what's called a recall petition. A recall petition means that 10% of the voters in his constituency can sign a petition to have a by-election. Now, that's important to understand, because essentially what this is, when he's alleging a witch hunt, as he is, and when he's calling the committee a kangaroo court, think about what the logic of that actually is. It means that a committee which has a Conservative majority, including a long-standing Brexiteer and a Tory MP from the Red Wall, has chosen to go for Boris Johnson, that they will make recommendations which the House of Commons, which has a Conservative majority, which he delivered not 3 years ago, will then vote for that. Then that 10% of his constituents will choose to have a recall referendum, a recall petition, and then that he would lose the by-election.
Yeah,
that's the allegation. That chain of events is what Boris Johnson is claiming is a witch hunt against him. It's absurd.
I forget how much you love the detail, Henry. We're going to have to move on. We're slightly short of time. Sonia, just a brief thought from you about the front page of the Eye. Just so many people concerned about their mortgages with interest rates set to rise.
Yeah, this is going to be a really worrying front page for so many people. So interest rates are now forecast to increase to 5.75% by the end of 2023, which means that we'll see mortgage rates upwards of 6%. Millions of people with fixed rate mortgages ending in the next 2-3 months who are going to have to try and refix at these new higher rates. That's going to add a huge amount onto people's monthly repayments at a time when the cost of living is going up, food and energy costs are higher. So I think it's a really worrying time for people.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly a huge concern for so many households. Sonia, Henry, thank you so much. Lots more to talk about in the next hour. We'll give you a little bit of a break. Thanks very much indeed. Do stay with us. Coming up next on Sky News at 11, we'll have more on the 3 people killed and the other 3 injured in a terrifying early morning attack in Nottingham. But police rule out terrorism. We'll have all the latest on that incident at the top of the hour.